We began our discussion with the preamble and the fact that we, the people, grant various powers to the federal government, also to the state governments, and the powers we don't give to them are retained by the people. Perhaps a challenging or nebulous concept, but let's begin to step through the Constitution of the United States of America, or potentially, as you see right here, uh, Constitution for the United States of America. What we begin with in Article 1 is that we give the legislative powers to a Congress, which includes a Senate and a House of Representatives. Briefly, if we were to compare this to the British system from which we came, that would essentially be the House of Lords and the House of Representatives. Now, the choice of Senate dates back to Roman times, where the senators were oftentimes the landed wealthy or gentry, and that a seat on the Senate was actually a very powerful um, position in ancient Rome. Even, and that's maybe where the usurpation of Caesar comes in, is that the Senate oftentimes was sort of the crowning glory of Roman thought. Not to get too far into Plutarch's Parallel Lives, which is a really good book that lets you study the Greeks and the Romans in ancient civilization and sort of helps you fit them into everything. It's a nice summary of the great people, Solon and others from Greece, Cicero, Alexander, who was a real crazy guy. But anyway, we have sort of a House of Commons, or the House of Representatives, and a House of Lords, better known as the Senate. And you may or may not buy into that, but as a broad categorization, that's really a fairly true statement of the initial design as well as the continuous functioning. The Senate is meant to be the most learned, the most people free of the usual entanglements of governors, that we can pay them under the table or bribe them or any of that. We know from long experience that that isn't completely true, but generally the Senate is sort of the upper crust, if you will, or and there is some reason to let senators serve for a long time. But let's jump ahead and go into what is really the full grant of the powers. And a good student should read it all. All right. Now, some of this is we can see it, the People's House. Here are these comments by the Senate website off to the side, and you may want to look at that. I'll leave you to explore that on your own. Let's jump to Section 8. This is where the Congress shall have power. All right? And so this phrase, the Congress shall have power, is then added to every phrase below. Now, for most legal environment of business students, as well as for most of us, here's the general powers that we see in the preamble. One of the big ones was pay the debts, provide for the common defense and general welfare. And notice that all duties, imposts, and excises of the government shall be uniform throughout the United States. As we're coming out of the Articles of the Confederacy, where each state could have its own taxation system, and we're now going to say, we need a federal government that has a uniform application of revenue raising, if you will. We also have the power given to the federal government to borrow money on the credit of the United States. This has been abused. We're $19 trillion in debt, and the estimates of our annual economy are anywhere from 17 to 24 trillion dollars is kind of the gross domestic product. So we basically have loaned away all of next year's production. So if all of us stopped eating, stopped driving, did everything, but somehow still could make all of that money, we could pay off the debt in 1 year. And the problem is it keeps growing and growing and growing. One of the ways that the federal government has gained more and more power over our lives individually, as well as anybody trying to run a business, is the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And let's draw this into perspective. What we're talking about here is that the state of North Carolina cannot enter into an agreement with Great Britain or the island of Barbados or Panama. This has to run through the federal government. That we want, if we're going to have agreements, we don't want the states competing against one another. Let me digress a second. You probably see this in your home municipality, where all the small cities in a county compete against one another for the new Walmart or the new Target store or the new whatever. All these retail establishments play municipalities off against one another. Well, if we let this happen at the state level, it might be that Montana comes up with some really fabulous, maybe let's make it Wyoming, because it has the best coal in the world that I'm aware of. Maybe they say, hey, to China, we got the good coal, we'll ship it to you, and we'll cut the price, and here's what we'll do, and we'll pay, blah, 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 blah. Well, that really puts a big strain on West Virginia, whose coal isn't quite as nice. I'm not going to go off into the EPA at this time, but as I'm recording this, our government is undertaking a war on coal, undertaking a war on natural resources that humans have relied on for a long time. Now, the big clause in here is among the several states. Under the Articles of Confederation, we could have taxation or duties at every state border. So, if we take the usual 12-mile limitation along coasts, and you look at the original 13 colonies, it's not absurd to say that shipping from Boston down to Savannah, Georgia, every state in that existing union could claim a right of taxation upon the goods as it traveled out in the ocean. Because if it stayed or, sort of did coasting, which is a standard way to navigate, not really a great way necessarily, but for a lot of tradesmen, they would go down the coast with various goods, that certain things would sell better in Philadelphia than they did in Dover, Delaware, or Newport, Rhode Island, or whatever. So this tries to get rid of this. The problem has been that this has permitted the federal government to come in and basically define all commerce as interstate commerce. It took a while for the courts to get there, but we're pretty much almost any business, and particularly now that we've got the internet available and wireless capabilities and phone capabilities, it's pretty hard for us to say the federal government doesn't have some power over almost every business. Perhaps the local landscaper aside, maybe I'm not thinking it through very well, but it's very hard for the individual to have other entities that apply to it. At the same time, we do have municipal and state regulations that each person's going to have to comply with. And Congress's failure to pass, and this, may or may not be a valid thing, to pass a national sales tax, and some of the current candidates talk about this sort of need for a national sales tax to replace some of the income tax. That's a value-added tax. You look at how it has started out in Europe. It was 6%, and it's over 20% now. It doesn't take long for politicians to see the need for more taxes. And taxes are a drag on productivity. They're a drag on what I can save. They're a drag on what you can save. But a lot of politicians think that the government can miraculously cure everything. Guess that this professor is a little bit more of a Reaganite, that, government is not the solution. Government is the problem. That we need some government, but as Thomas Jefferson said, we govern best when we govern least. Anyway, we tribe on him too, but he's pretty much of an autocrat like Jackson and an abuser of federal power. Anyway, leave that as it is. This is where we've seen a huge growth in federal power, and you can see it in the Senate's notes here. Interstate commerce covers all movement of people and things across state lines and every form of communication and transportation. They're swallowing up everything. You open up a phone, even if it's an intrastate call, you're calling from Bloomington, Indiana to West Lafayette. You're at the university system in Indiana. Too bad, you've just engaged in some kind of interstate transmission, simply because the lines can go interstate. Last thing is that the Indian tribes are also set up distinctly. And this is an interesting part of, and probably shouldn't use the word interesting, but it's an interesting part of how this is formed, that we have individual sovereignty with the Indian tribes or the Native American tribes, it's part of why gambling came onto those places first, because even inside a state that prohibited gambling, Indian tribes were sovereign nations and could do their own stuff. So this one's another one of these tug and pull items that only the federal government really maintains power to regulate commerce with the Indian tribes. This maybe has limited the states to some extent. And if we go back to that first lecture, this is kind of what we're talking about. What are the states' rights? Are we better off with a smaller government that we can maybe talk to? Or are we better off with this giant government that knows all and sees all, and as we'll see, cannot district itself very long? But notice we've got established uniform rules on naturalization. This gives the federal government power over immigration. Here's one of the ones that a lot of people say is the most powerful thing given to the federal government: to coin money, regulate the value thereof. As we look at the Federal Reserve System, put into place, I believe, around 1913, as we've gone all the way down to zero and contemplation of negative interest rates, we have central banks throughout the world regulating economies. Now, that's a big stretch from value of currency. Big difference between I can now sort of regulate how much that transaction is worth in real dollar systems, as opposed to two people agreeing that I will do that for $10. We've now got central bankers who are really kind of controlling whether that value retains value. And so we have post offices. Here's one of the greatest ones, and I think you can see Franklin's hand over it: to promote the progress of science and useful arts. If Ben Franklin didn't write that, I'm a monkey's uncle. To exclusive rights of writings and discoveries. Here is our patent authority. And while we might talk about the patent authority having grown out of control, at least we have that system in place. Other nations don't. And they don't respect our patents, and they don't really care about it. Notice that they also, the Congress can do tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, so that the Supreme Court cannot create its own courts. Congress creates them. So, to define and punish piracies, here's a great one. Declare war. Since we declared war on Japan, we've fought a lot of wars, and we have declared one. Very interesting stuff. War powers, raise and support armies. Early years, no standing army, because the British had taught us that having a standing army meant war. I'm a big fan of our military, and I like a standing army. I like the fact that we're ready to go anywhere, anytime, and that we can maybe stand there to help people. So hopefully as you're listening to me, you're also reading what the Senate has to say on its website about this. Without American power, without the power of the free world, we create a vacuum, and the hegemonious countries come in and they will rule and dictate, much like Germany and Japan attempted to do. We can make arguments that we should not have gone into those wars for any reason. That's sort of George Washington foreign entanglement stuff. But most people who enter our military come out better people. Not completely true. There certainly are problems with both of them. But notice that we were to have a Navy. We were going to have a standing Navy. And this is because we always traded overseas. That's one of the advantages of being a coastal environment, but we also had long ties to Europe, and so we wanted to sell there. So here's some more about the militia. We've seen that kind of move away. Now we're getting into areas that I don't know that much about. I'll be blunt. We can get into this, but notice that the militias are really what we usually are the state National Guards. And we've used them a lot. We use them tremendously amount in Iraq and Afghanistan. So here we go. We have and then Section 9, privilege of the right of habeas corpus shall not be suspended when in cases of rebellion or invasion of public safety may require it. This is a congressional power. Lincoln got into a little bit of a trouble here because he suspended the writ of habeas corpus in the Civil War. Primarily put down insurrections near Baltimore, at least at the beginning, but he kept it suspended the whole time. Does the president have that power? The Congress came along and said, yeah, that's fine. We've got Bill of Attainder, no capitation or other direct tax, so that that's why we had to pass the 16th Amendment to go to the income tax, because you can't really just tax people for living. But an income tax in its reality is a tax on living. Of course, any tax imposed on any merchant is ordinarily a tax paid by the people, paid by the consumer. This is kind of, I could go through every clause. They're all very important. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. And this has been litigated because Kentucky has colonels, but you cannot give, we want to know aristocracy, even though we've got a Senate that sort of is meant to be an aristocracy. And we do have people who think once they're in power that they should retain all power, and that they're above the law. They think that the Magna Carta, for some reason, doesn't extend into leaders of the United States of America. But so basically, this is kind of the powers given to Congress. If it's not listed there, Congress doesn't have that power. So that's why we look to, did Congress have the power to do this? And so, the Affordable Care Act one, which is an interesting split between conservatives for, progressives for. The four progressives said, "Oh yes, that's a general welfare power," or it just did. This is Congress is given broad powers. The conservatives tended to say, no, this is regulating commerce, but it's way too big. It's telling people what they must buy. And then Justice Roberts said, no, it comes out of the power of the government to tax. So we have one of a very odd decision, a 4-1-4, but because he ruled that it is okay, we sort of get a House of Lords decision where we get 5 people agree, even though it's really only 4 agree with one theory, 4 agree with a different theory, and then 1 agrees with result, but not theory of the other 4. Anyway, not one of my favorite opinions, and I'm not certain how you get to that when the president himself said, "Oh, this is not a tax." But let's let that one go. This is a fabulous country, and we have the rule of law, and we're lucky we have a constitution that we can come back and say to our leaders, "You're overstepping your power." It may be that as they get into their cozy clubs, they pat one another on the back and say, "Nope, no problem." But periodically, we do find that our judges and our leaders and our legislators and our presidents stand up and stand firm, and they use this document as the basis for that. And anyway, that closes this lecture.